Hi, I'm Stumpy Nubs, and this is my new pattern-based box joint machine for the table saw. In the July 2016 issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, you'll find a comparison of 5 box joint jigs created by myself, Matthias Wandel, and John Heinz. It's a really fascinating look at how these awesome jigs have developed over the years. I'll put a link in the notes below the video so you can check it out. This jig was one of those mentioned. It's designed to be used with a table saw, and it works with a dado set, or if you don't have a dado set, you can use it with a single 1/8" kerf blade. It features a paper pattern where you can actually see how your joint will look on the board. There are different layouts for various joint spacing right on the pattern. Cursors indicate where both sides of your blade will cut in relation to the pattern, making it easy to nibble out wider fingers with multiple passes of a narrow blade. When you see those cursors on the pattern, it's actually showing you exactly where both sides of the blade will be on the board. So it's a lot easier to know where your cuts are going to happen, and you'll avoid some mistakes. Those two features, the pattern and the dual cursors, make it possible to also do things that common box joint jigs won't do, such as variable spacing. This joint features 3 different finger sizes, 1/8", 1/4", and 1/2", and it was cut with this jig and a single saw blade without having to stop mid-cut to make any changes to the setup. We'll also be making a video in the near future that will show you how to make complex inlaid joints with this jig. This type of precision is possible because of a homemade lead screw positioner. There are 8 threads per inch on the lead screw, which happens to be the width of a standard saw blade, and all of the markings on the pattern are also divisible by 1/8 inch. All of that combines to create positive stops at each point on the pattern. You can operate the jig by sliding the cursor to the point on the pattern you wish to cut, and the locking mechanism meshes threads with the lead screw. If the carriage is slightly out of place, the meshing threads will nudge it into position, auto-correcting for any error once you clamp it down. That means you only have to get it close to the mark, and the jig will take it from there. That helps if you've got maybe poor eyesight or you're working quickly and you just don't get it right on every time. It's going to take care of that for you. There's also a crank on the side for micro-adjusting the jig to the finest measurements. In a separate video, which you'll find in the upcoming August 2016 issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, I'll show you how to use this jig to cut different joints, including those inlaid finger joints. We'll also have plans available on our website shortly if you need help building your own. You'll find links to all of that in the notes below the video and in the homemade tools section of stumpynubs.com. But in this video, I'll show you how the jig was designed and built and give you some tips to help if you decide to build it yourself. So let's get started. As with any precision jig, you should use good materials. I use cabinet grade plywood, which I purchase off the rack at Home Depot. It doesn't have to be the really expensive stuff like Baltic birch, just a quality sheet of hardwood veneered plywood, not the pine stuff. As you assemble your parts, take your time to ensure that everything is positioned correctly. Double check your measurements and make sure everything goes on square. This is the base of the jig. The brackets in the center create a blade guard to protect your fingers during use. I decided to go with a closed carriage design on this jig because I wanted to use drawer slides to ensure smooth movement. I experimented with a closed carriage on my first jig a few years ago, and then an open carriage on my second jig a couple years ago. I really think that the closed carriage design was the best. To align the drawer slides, I set my combination square to half their width. In this case, that's 7/8 inch. Then I use it to strike a line down the front of the carriage 7/8 inch from the top edge. Now I reset my square to the distance from the bottom edge to that line I just drew. This will allow me to strike a second line on the back of the carriage that is the same distance from the bottom edge as the line on the front was. These lines will indicate the center point for the drawer slides. I mount the inner portions of the slides so that the tabs are touching the end of the carriage as shown here. The other half of the drawer slides get mounted on mating panels. I draw another center line 7/8 inch from the edge to help me align them too. By always using that 7/8 of an inch or half the width of my assembled slide, I can ensure that both the wide outer portions and the narrow inner portions are correctly located and will mate together once I assemble the full carriage. See? The slides align perfectly even though my components are of different sizes. The assembled carriage slides between the raised platform and the front rail on the jig body. I place a couple of washers beneath the carriage to raise it up about 3/16 of an inch on both ends. Then I drill 1/8" pilot holes in the front and back panels. These holes pass through the carriage panels and into the jig body. I repeat the process on the other end of the carriage as well, which you can't see in this view. Next, I use a 1/4" bit to enlarge the holes in the carriage, but not in the body of the jig. These larger holes, along with the identical ones on the other end of the carriage, will make it possible to adjust the carriage's position simply by loosening the screws and shifting the carriage up or down a tiny bit, should I find that it's not holding my workpieces perfectly perpendicular to the top of the saw. I always try to build such adjustment features into my jigs where possible. The lead screw is a 1" threaded rod. On my previous jig, I used a 3/8" threaded rod that had threads every 1/16 of an inch. I've changed to the coarser 8 threads per inch, 1" rod because the coarser threads mesh together a lot easier. I believe John Heinz also used 1/8" rod on his jig, although he doesn't use the same meshing principle. I attach nuts to the ends permanently by boring holes and driving pins into them. Epoxy would have worked just as well, but I wanted to try this method out. The nuts are positioned on the rod so that they pinch against the two ends of that plywood panel beneath the rod. It's important that those nuts are positioned properly against the ends of that plywood, or the rod will be able to shift up and down the length of the panel. You don't want that, not even a little bit. I used a pair of 1" pipe hanger brackets, which I had to bend open just a little bit so that they could fit over the rod. The idea is to secure the rod down so that it will turn easily but not rattle around at all. This is the plexiglass shield that covers the patterns. I carefully countersunk some mounting holes along its length. Properly scribing the cursor lines is critical. You want them exactly 1/8 of an inch apart. I set the edge of my knife into the etched lines on my steel rule, leaving a nick on the edge of the plexiglass next to it as I did. That ensured that my marks were going to be in the exact locations I needed them. Take your time, get this right. I used the square to extend those little nicks that I made across the face of the plexiglass. Don't try to scratch too deeply on your first stroke. You don't want the blade to wander away from the ruler's edge. You'll only need 2 lines if you intend to use this jig exclusively with an 1/8" saw blade. Add a 3rd line if you'll use a 1/4" dado set, a 4th for when you use a 3/8" set, and so on. Really, I eventually went back and made another one with just 3 lines for a 1/4" dado set because the multiple lines did get a little confusing for me. The shield mounts on the bottom of the lead screw assembly. To mount the lead screw assembly to the jig body, temporarily lay your paper pattern, which is included in the downloadable plans on our website, in place. Then set the lead screw assembly on top. I use the same enlarged hole method to attach the assembly to the body of the jig as I did with the carriage before, so that the assembly can be adjusted later. If you find that the shield is dragging too much on top of that pattern, making the carriage hard to move, then just loosen the screws and raise the lead screw assembly up a tiny bit to reduce the friction. To make the positioner, I used a hacksaw to cut a 1" nut in half. Half of that nut slips over the threaded rod on the lead screw assembly. I'm going to use a toggle clamp to raise and lower that split nut. Depending on the height of your clamp, you'll have to shim beneath it so that it is level with the top of the nut. A block of wood will be attached to the top of the clamp so that the end is laying on that split nut. Pencil marks indicate where to bore holes for bolts to attach it to the clamp. It's important that the end of the block doesn't hit the ends of the mounting screws nearby, so keep it back on the nut itself. The block is intentionally wider than the clamp for extra strength. It's attached with carriage bolts, nuts, and washers. The split nut should be scuffed with a file to help the epoxy adhere to it. Place it on the rod next to that clamp that's holding the rod down, which I installed backwards in this video, oops. Spread a generous amount of quick set epoxy. I use JB Quick. Then place the toggle clamp and block on top. I use the positioner brackets to help square the toggle clamp up before the epoxy set. Don't attach those brackets to the jig yet, just set them in place as a guide. After the epoxy dries, I remove the clamp and gob some more epoxy around the nut to make sure I had a good strong bond. When that dries, replace the clamp with the nut threads meshed onto the threads on the rod and secure it down with screws to the body of the jig. Mount the two brackets tightly against the side of the clamping block. You do not want that clamp to be able to flex from side to side at all, so mount it tightly against each side. To make the crank, I bored a double hole in the center of 2 discs. Then I used a chisel to cut out the shape of a 1-inch nut in each half. The nut fits in the recess and gets sandwiched between the 2 discs. The larger holes are for looks, but I also bored a smaller hole to glue in a crank handle. More epoxy on the end of the threaded rod will hold the crank in place. Be sure to let it cure fully before you attempt to turn it. The final step is to add an adjustable fence and a piece of T-track to the carriage. And that's it. The jig looks complicated, but it's really a lot easier to build than you think. I just showed you the whole process and gave you some of the tips that you're going to need to build it yourself. If you want the actual measurements, along with step-by-step instructions, complete with photos to guide you, you can get a set of plans from our homemade tool section on our website at stumpynubs.com, which helps support us. If you want to see the jig in action, check out the August 2016 issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, which you can access for free once it's out in the archives on our website. Happy finger joining!